Hey, it's Ryan. And if you enjoyed hearing about the outbreak in Mont Chavon, I wanted to share a few clips from our Outbreak series, which is currently available to supporting members. You'll hear from frontline teams involved in mass aconite poisonings in Canada, thebaine contaminated poppy seed poisoning in Australia, and some truly wild investigations, including a bongkrecic acid outbreak where investigators helped exonerate a man who had been accused of poisoning his entire community. In this preview, you'll hear the opening and first few minutes of several of those conversations. But if you want to hear the full episode, please consider becoming a supporting member, because your support helps cover the real, ongoing costs of making this show and allows us to keep sharing it for free with anyone who wants to learn more about the value of public health in mass poisoning. Hey everybody, you are listening to The Poison Lab, a show about poisoning from people who manage poisoning. I'm your host, Ryan Feldman, clinical toxicologist and emergency medicine pharmacist. Today's episode is something brand new and something I've been really excited to share with you. I've been working on it for over a year. It marks the start of a special series that we're calling Outbreak. These episodes explore real-world poisoning outbreaks, hearing directly from the people that were there. And we're going to kick this series off with my absolute favorite toxin, aconite, a deadly plant alkaloid known as the queen of poisons. If you've listened before, you might remember one of our earlier episodes called Open and Shut, where I talked about aconite and how it's been used in some interesting murders with two colleagues of mine who had co-published a review paper with me on aconite. Between the three of us, across 3 different health systems and multiple poison centers, we had collectively taken care of 1 case of aconite in all of our combined careers. It's a famous poison, but it's not around very often now. Yet on a single night in Markham, Ontario, 12 people were poisoned after eating a take-out chicken dish. I mean, put yourself in their shoes. You're eating dinner with a friend. You notice a bitter taste, numbness on the tongue, and suddenly your friend collapses. Others in the restaurant start to experience similar symptoms. I can only imagine being one of the impacted patients, let alone the people who need to respond to this. And in this episode, we'll talk to those experts who managed to keep everyone safe during this outbreak. You'll hear from Dr. Jessica Kent, an emergency physician and the current toxicology fellow who helped the toxicology team during this outbreak. You'll hear from Dr. Abhinay Sathya, an intensivist who managed some of the most critically ill patients with limited resources as multiple people presented to his hospital. We'll hear from Dr. Margaret Thompson, the on-call toxicologist for the Ontario Poison Centre, who was fielding calls not only from hospitals trying to treat patients, but from patients who were worried that they were going to become sick from eating at the restaurant. And finally, we'll hear from the lab team who played a critical role in confirming that this poisoning was from aconitine, the toxin found in the aconite plant. Dr. Randy Purvis and analytical chemist Bryn Shermer walk us through what they had to go through, scrambling to confirm that this was aconite, as well as their experience in a number of other poisoning outbreaks, and how you can find a poison when you're not actually sure what you're looking for. I cannot wait to share this episode about what it was like to be on the front lines of an extremely lethal mass poisoning and how they navigated the unknown and what we can learn from them to be ready for the next one. A note to the listeners. This show is made by medical professionals, and many medical professionals are listeners. We occasionally run into some medical jargon, but this content is really for everyone, and I do my best to make sure everyone can follow along. And I'm really excited to let you know that the next installment of this series, which is a 5-part mini-series, is specifically designed to ensure that anyone who's interested in learning about these poisoning outbreaks can understand it all. Now, before we dive in, just a quick shout out to our supporting members. Thank you so much. Your support keeps this project alive. Members get early access to episodes, ad-free listening, bonus content, and access to expanded versions of episodes. The supporting membership has had access to this episode for months, and I'm hopeful to bring a more in-depth discussion to them as well. If you want to help us grow and share these stories to help care for the next poison patient, you can help support our operating costs for as little as $1 a month at www.thepoisonlab.com/support. But you actually don't need to pay anything to support the show. I'm just happy you're here. And if you find this valuable, rating and reviewing it wherever you're listening will help us share our message. Finally, one last disclaimer. The Poison Lab is for educational purposes only. It is not medical advice. If you think someone's been poisoned, or you find yourself in the position needing to care for 12 people poisoned by plants, call your local poison center. In the U.S., that number is 1-800-222-1222, or contact your doctor. Poison centers will provide you with free, confidential medical advice 24/7 that you don't have to get from a podcast. All right, let's get into it. Cannot wait to bring you this first episode of the Outbreak series, Inside the Aconite Poisoning of Markham, Ontario.
6 deaths have now been linked to the capsules, laced with cyanide.
Parishioners at church became sick after drinking coffee tainted with arsenic.
An outbreak of lead poisoning tied to pouches of cinnamon applesauce.
$100,000 reward to anyone with information on who may have poisoned.
Hey everybody, you are listening to The Poison Lab, a show about poisoning from people who treat poison. And today we have a really rarefied group of guests. You heard in the intro what we're talking about today, a mass outbreak of poisoning. And I have 3 guests on with me today. I'd like to have them introduce themselves to you so you can hear exactly who they are and what their work involves and how they were involved in this outbreak, which they're going to walk us through. And I'd like to start off with the person who I was able to cajole into agreeing to this in the first place, and that would be Dr. Jessica Kent. Would you mind introducing yourself to the listeners?
My name's Jess. I am a second-year fellow at the University of Toronto's Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology program. I'm also an emergency physician at St. Michael's Hospital. And starting off with me, I had the most limited role in the management of these cases, as the fellow actually wasn't on call that night, but was on the next day. And I was tasked with getting the story together from our end, ICU, and the public health end, but I did very little of the management myself.
But you were the connector of the pieces.
Yeah.
Which is very important. And most importantly, you had an email address for me to reach out to, which was super helpful. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Abinay Saithya.
Yeah, my name's Abinay. I'm an intensivist at Markham Stouffville Hospital as well as St. Joseph's Hospital in Toronto. And I was involved that night taking care of some of the patients in the ICU.
Thank you, Dr. Saithya. And finally, a perspective I think will be incredibly important for many of the listeners, Dr. Margaret Thompson.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret. I am an emergency physician at St. Michael's Hospital with Jessica. As well, I am the toxicologist who was on call for the Ontario Poison Centre on the night of the incident and corresponded with Dr. Abinay about the care of these patients.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. So we have a poison center perspective. We have a frontline clinician perspective. We have the fellow on cleanup duty the next day perspective, which is, I've seen that happen as well. Sometimes something happens and the next day, everyone has to deal with it as well. So these are all great perspectives to have here. So I guess I'd like to start off just with a little clip. I'm going to read you something from the Markham Reddit. I know. And this was from the night of, and it says, "This is just a heads up to anyone working today about a serious presentation occurring overnight in Markham, just in case anyone sees this in the emergency department. All patients ate a chicken dish at an Asian restaurant located in Markham. The patients complained of bitter taste of the food, followed by numbness, tingling of the face, body, extreme nausea and vomiting, then cardiac arrhythmias and hypotension. 6 presenting to MSH, 4 in ventricular tachycardia, 3 coding, 5 in the ICU, 2 intubated, and 4 more patients redirected to other hospitals. Patients presented with sodium channel-like toxicity and responded to bicarbon boluses and infusions. police and public health are involved, but this restaurant was serving food up until last night. This fits the effects of a plant called wolfsbane, but we're only speculating to the actual cause right now. So that was an internet user on a message board on the night of the Markham outbreak. And it sounds like there was a lot of patients presenting to multiple areas at once, but I'd love to hear a little bit of a timeline from those who were there. So would you mind briefly describing the outbreak? When did you notice there was potentially more than one patient? Was this something that multiple hospitals contacted a poison center for, and that gave us a signal, or did multiple patients show up to one hospital? Can I hear a little bit about the beginning?
I might take a little bit of that on. I think the information that was posted on Reddit was wrong based on...
Wait. The internet was wrong? This is news.
Having, reviewed the case series a number of times, we know that there was, nobody in cardiac arrest, et cetera, et cetera. I think we should leave that to Abinay because he was on the floor in the emergency department in the ICU at the affected hospital.
Yeah, fair enough. So I think it was quite obvious up front that there was some type of exposure or toxin. And I remember getting called saying that there were 2 patients in the emergency department with refractory ventricular tachycardia. And the emerge doctors had asked me to come see the patient, come help with them. And they had the story up front that it was immediately after eating this chicken dish from this restaurant. So I think pretty early on, we identified that it was some type of exposure, toxicology related presentation. And at that point, when I got to the emerge, it was very clear that there were another 2 patients, I think, in the emerge with the same symptoms. And they were giving me information that there were 7 other patients who had similar symptoms that would be on their way to our hospital. And realizing that this is like a disaster for us because we're not we're a community hospital and I don't have like residents or fellows or anything like that. It's just me. And so I think it was relatively early on that we knew that this would be something that may exceed our capacity to manage all of these patients. So that's kind of when we identified that A, that there was some type of poisoning, and B, that there were going to be a lot of patients potentially coming in.
So it sounds like perhaps an attribute of this specific poison, which is that it does tend to be rapid acting, may have provided a benefit in identifying the source here, which was the patients themselves noted the temporal relationship between ingesting the food and developing symptoms. Somebody said, I ate something and I'm feeling bad. Nobody had to go in and say, give me the last 10 meals you ate, or what have you been doing differently?
And even more specifically, they noted that it tasted really strange as they were eating it, which is within the first few bites. And so I think the link to the food was very clear and obvious.
Yeah. The bitter taste of many toxic alkaloids is a well-developed evolutionary intuition. Bitterness in past foods, if you don't recognize that, sometimes it leads to you not being able to pass that bitterness trait on. And I can only imagine suddenly realizing, well, okay, we have multiple people presenting from one restaurant, or from at least corroborating they each ate the same thing. That immediately is going to bring up some alarm bells. You're at a resource limited site. Can you talk a little bit about who did you call for help in this essentially poisoning mass casualty scenario?
Dr. Sathya had called the Code Orange in his facility and had been able to divert patients to another facility.
Can I clarify Code Orange?
Oh, sorry. The Code Orange for us is like the external disaster code, so that this isn't quite a disaster in the traditional sense of the word, but essentially call people in and, put the hospital and the system on alert to kind of mobilize some resources. Luckily, we have a great team at the hospital. I think there were 2 emerge docs on who were extremely helpful, helping manage all the patients. There's an overnight internist who could offload some of the other patients who needs to be taken care of. And I called my director of the ICU in both to help manage like flow issues, because I just wanted to be able to focus on patient care. But also she was helpful in managing some of the really sick patients as well. So I was able to mobilize a lot of resources and help.
Did everyone go to the ICU?
No. So not everybody went. I think we took the sickest, 4 patients maybe up to the ICU to manage. A couple of them were less sick and were just watched to emerge with similar treatments. And so
in relation to the actual outbreak itself, so you got multiple things going on here. Number one, you have incredibly sick patients that are experiencing life-threatening toxicity. Number two, you don't know how many are out there or were exposed. So from a now maybe, public health standpoint, when did we start to involve any other organizations, or what were next steps from there? Okay, there is your intro to the aconite episode. Now let's transition over to the thebaine episode. Hey everybody, you are listening to The Poison Lab, a show about poisoning from people who treat poisoning. And oh my, do we have such a fascinating story to share with you today. Before I forget, I'm your host, clinical toxicologist and emergency medicine pharmacist Ryan Feldman. I cannot believe what I'm going to get to share with you today. If you've been following along, you know that we've started a new series called Outbreak. And this is another rendition of that series where we investigate real-world poisoning outbreaks through the eyes of the clinicians, scientists, public health teams, and sometimes even patients who have to figure out what is happening, how it's happening, and how to stop it, all in real time. Our first episode took us to Ontario, where a mass poisoning caused by the plant alkaloid aconite, also known as the queen of poisons, sent emergency departments scrambling when many patients were showing up with lethal arrhythmias. And we saw how a team on the front line pieced together that mystery and coordinated with public health and poison centers to keep everyone safe. But today, our story jumps halfway around the world to Australia. Well, at least halfway around the world for me. And we're going to be talking about a poison that really, I think no one saw coming. Because this outbreak started with something so ordinary and boring that it almost feels like a prank. Poppy seeds. Yeah, the ones on your bagel. But they were being used in a different way. But let me set the scene for you. And to do that, I'm going to use the tip of the spear of all things toxicology, Reddit.com. I swear to you, anytime there's a new poisoning trend or a poisoning outbreak, there is someone on Reddit who reported it first. And I'm going to read to you a post from a Reddit user back in 2023, and it's titled Paralysis. This was a user describing their recent experience with poppy seeds. They go on to say, I had a really horrible experience 2 days ago. One I wasn't planning on sharing, but I wonder if other people have had it too. I've been using opiates for about 10 years, and I managed to cut out everything except poppy seed tea. I made about 500 grams into a tea, and it tasted incredibly bitter. Within an hour, I felt stiffness in my neck that spread down my whole body. When I tried to get up, my legs wouldn't work. I had to lift myself with my arms. My knees wouldn't bend. My extremities were in terrible pain, and after about 3 hours, it passed. The next day, I had just a few mouthfuls of this tea, and it all happened again. I have no idea what could have caused this. Could it be pesticides, insecticides? How could this be happening in a food-grade product? That is the end of the post. And that question, how could this be happening, was asked by more than 40 people across multiple states in Australia, and by all the frontline clinicians trying to manage a wave of patients arriving with bizarre symptoms. Rigid muscles, spasticity, tremor, and in severe cases, seizure and cardiac arrest. All after drinking homemade poppy seed tea. Now, if you've not heard about that, you're going to hear more about it on the podcast. But this is something people do to try and extract residual opioids that are left on the seed pods after they're harvested. And the culprit in this case was an opioid, as we come to find out. one called thebaine. Not one that many people know about, and it has a very unique pharmacologic profile similar to another toxin, which we'll hear about. And in this episode, you're going to hear directly from the medical toxicologist who compared notes when they had a rash of patients showing up with unusual symptoms and a similar history, recognized a mass poisoning outbreak, and sprung into action to keep people safe. We'll be hearing from Dr. Catherine Isoardi, an emergency physician, toxicologist, and the medical director of the Queensland Poisons Information Center. We'll also hear from Dr. Amanda Holford, one of the toxicology fellows who is charged with caring for many of these patients and helping coordinate some of the public health response with Dr. Isoardi. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Darren Roberts, medical director of the New South Wales Poisons and Information Center and a specialist in nephrology, clinical pharmacology, and addiction medicine. You'll hear how they discovered the first patients and quickly realized there was many more and even some they had missed scattered across Australia. We'll hear how they discovered that this was actually a food-grade product and the implications that had on trying to prevent millions of people from becoming harmed by something on the grocery store shelves. We'll hear about what it's like to manage one of these patients with this severe and unique toxicity and what we've learned about this poison from this outbreak. And on top of all of that, this outbreak also revealed some fascinating insights into the pharmaceutical industry and their poppy processing and labeling practices, which might have lessons for preventing this type of outbreak from happening in the future. I cannot wait to share this story with you. It is a fascinating ride of toxicology, pharmacology, epidemiology, and detective work that can help us prevent the next poisoning outbreak in the future. But before we dive in, I want to give a quick thank you to our supporting members. You keep this project going, and members get early access to episodes. They've had access to this for over a month. They also get ad-free listening, bonus content, and some extended interviews when they're available. If you'd like to support our show, which helps spread safety information about poisoning and public health information, you can do so for as little as $1 a month. You just head over to thepoisonlab.com/support. And if you do, thank you for helping to support the ongoing costs of website hosting, podcast hosting, audio engineering software, editing, and more. It really helps. But you don't have to pay anything to support the show. One thing you can do right now that's totally free is rate the show wherever you're listening. It helps us share this important public health information with anyone interested in toxicology. No matter how you choose to support the show, thank you for being here and being part of this community, which makes the show so much fun. Now, we're going to dive in, and we are going to talk about how these physicians manage these poisonings. But as a reminder, this show is for educational purposes only. It is not medical advice. If you think you or someone else has been poisoned, call your local poison center immediately. In the U.S., that number is 1-800-222-1222. All right, without further ado, I'm so excited to bring you this rendition of the Poison Lab outbreak inside the Australian poppy seed tea poisoning.
6 deaths have now been linked to the capsules, laced with cyanide.
Parishioners at church became sick after drinking coffee tainted with arsenic.
An outbreak of lead poisoning tied to pouches of cinnamon applesauce.
$100,000 reward to anyone with information on who may have poisoned.
Hey everybody, you are listening to the Poison Lab, a show about poisoning from people who manage poisoning. And this is part of our special edition of Poisoning Outbreaks, where we sit down with the people who are on the front lines of managing acute poisoning outbreaks. We get to learn from the experience of those who were there on the front lines doing this to help us understand how we can treat the next poisoning outbreak better. And this is a really fascinating outbreak that I heard from one of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Isoardi, who we're going to hear from in just a moment, about an outbreak of thebaine toxicity from poppy seeds introduced into the Australian food supply. So I have with me some of the frontline clinicians who helped handle this outbreak, treat patients who were poisoned, and keep the rest of the public safe. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So first up, I have Dr. Catherine Isoardi.
Thanks, Ryan, for having me. Kath, I'm an emergency physician and clinical toxicologist based in Brisbane in Australia, and I'm the medical director for our toxicology unit at the Princess Alexandra Hospital, but also for the Queensland Poisons Information Centre. And for this cluster, I was involved with firstly identifying the signal and then helping coordinate the response for when we detected this cluster of poisonings.
And first author of the paper, A Cluster of Thebaine Poisoning from Non-Food Grade Poppy Seeds in the Australian Food Supply, which will be linked in the show notes along with a few other papers that came out of this specific outbreak. So please be sure to check them out if you want more details than we'll be able to cover in just this short interview. And next, I want to introduce someone I first heard of from one of our most esteemed toxicologist in the U.S., one of our only nephrotoxicologist, Dr. Josh King, who listeners would know has been on past episode 36 about nephrotoxins. And he, who I thought was maybe one of the first nephrotoxicologists, informed me that there was another. And he is currently in Australia, and that is Dr. Darren Roberts, who is here with us on the show. And I am very excited at the opportunity to talk to yet another nephrotoxicologist. So Dr. Roberts, thank you for joining. I appreciate it.
No worries, Dr. Feldman.
Okay, Ryan's fine.
You call me Dr. Roberts, you're going to get Dr. Feldman.
All right.
Your choice.
That's fair.
Thanks very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm a medical toxicologist, as you've heard, also a nephrologist, addiction medicine specialist, and we have a specialty in Australia called clinical pharmacology as well. So I am the medical director of the New South Wales Poison Centre, so we're the state below where Kath and Amanda are, as well as a toxicologist working at a hospital called the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. So my roles within this was that we had patients come through my hospital, plus also as the medical director of the Poison Centre in New South Wales, I was the spokesperson for New South Wales Health and one of the lead clinicians involved with coordinating our response within our state, looking at our data and also communicating with some of the federal bodies as well, who are involved with the regulation and communications relating food-related misadventures, if we can call it that. So it's very busy and exciting times.
Thank you so much for joining. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Amanda Holford.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm also one of the clinical toxicologists and emergency physicians at the PA hospital with Kath, who's my director. And at the time of the incident, I was the Monday morning toxicology fellow, tasked with, heard in some of your other podcasts, tidying up and doing the investigation for the case that had been identified over the weekend and calling and initiating the initial public health notification.
I love that the Monday morning toxicologist has now become a term. And it is certainly a thing. Someone winds up on cleanup duty the next day after some things start going off, and there's a lot to do. Getting the processes moving on the infrastructure that has to get into place to start tracking and tracing, certainly an incredibly important task. So really great to have your perspective here. Now, this was a really unique outbreak and something I haven't really heard a lot about in the past. It involved poppy seeds, and we're going to get into that, but let's maybe start just from the beginning of the story. Do you remember what day this was when it happened? Was this a Monday? Was this a Friday when you found it?
It was a Thursday. It was a Thursday. It was in early November, 2nd of November, 2022. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked at a hospital close by to ours to tell us about this patient that was really sick. So he was 46. Initially, he'd called the ambulance about some spasms, but by the time they arrived there, he was actually having a seizure, and promptly after that arrested with a pulseless electrical activity arrest, which deteriorated to asystole, and they had done standard life support for about 15 minutes before they got return of circulation and had brought him into hospital. And so my mate was seeing him in the emergency department, and she was telling me that he looked awful. By this stage, he was ventilated and paralysed and on suppressors, but his first pH was 6.5 and his first lactate was 25. And there'd been a story that he used poppy seed tea, and she was wondering whether or not this could be associated with it. And famous last words, I was like, oh, it doesn't sound like it. You don't usually get seizures. You don't usually get really profound metabolic acidosis unless he'd been down for a long time. Maybe he's also had some stimulants. The history wasn't super clear, except that he regularly used poppy seed tea. And I really hadn't thought a lot about it at that point, and I just discounted along the sides of
either way, we're going to manage him supportively. We're going to do maximal organ support, try to correct his pH, look after him. And we just kept a close eye on it. But there was no other issues beyond that stage. And he just went up to ICU and started to slowly get better.
Let me just take a pause here. So you had coming in a history of poppy seed tea.
That he used, not necessarily so much immediately prior to this all happening, just it was someone who used poppy seed tea and that they were critically unwell and had an out-of-hospital arrest and had a profound acidemia and had some seizures.
And this is a question we get all the time in consulting work with poison centers is, can this do this? We get all questions all the time. A patient ate a mushroom they found in the woods. They're in VTAC now. Are these related? No, not usually.
Well, exactly it. I was like, that would be so unusual. People use poppy seed tea to get the opioid effects, and this isn't what we would normally expect with it. And so all of it sounded a little bit odd. And you think if someone might use one type of recreational substance, that perhaps they might use another. And I thought, keep an open mind. Perhaps there's some stimulants on board. Irrespective, we're going to be managing this patient supportively and moving on from there. So that was the first case that certainly I was aware of, and that was certainly my advice initially. So I really wasn't too suspicious of the poppy seed tea.
And when I think of poppy seed tea, I think of opioids. And when I think of opioids, I rarely think of seizures. I think of sedation, respiratory depression, all these things, and then eventually hypoxia. But let's actually just take a step back. Because poppy seed tea is going to feature so prominently here, and I'm not sure it'll be something that everyone is familiar with. Can you give us some background on poppy seed tea and how people use this in Australia?
I can say a few words on that. So poppy seed tea is something that I've come across through addiction medicine practice, but relatively uncommonly. And I think before this cluster, we didn't really know how much or how often this was occurring. And actually, it was through this cluster that we realized probably how commonplace poppy seed tea is. So what is poppy seed tea? Poppy seeds contain opioids. And so that means that people can extract those opioids quite easily just by putting poppy seeds into water. Then the poppy seeds are strained off and then the liquid is consumed. And within that is mixtures of morphine and codeine. There's different types of poppy seeds that are used or sold around the world. Some are washed and some are unwashed. Within Australia, poppy seeds are not washed. What that means is they're covered in the latex, and that latex contains the opioids.
And I want to define that word for the listeners, the latex. So everyone might be aware of poppy because it's where a lot of opioids come from, and it contains natural opiates within it. And you get it from the latex, which is the white sap-like substance that comes when you cut the pod open. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yeah.
Okay. And then that sap substance gets on the seeds itself. So you said washed versus unwashed. The unwashed are more potent because they contain the latex. So the seeds don't have the opiates. It's actually the latex that's covering the seeds. So unwashed poppy seeds have more latex and thus more opiates. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And some countries will allow food grade poppy seeds to be sold which are unwashed, for example, in Australia, whereas some countries will require them to be washed.
In order to reduce the likelihood of getting opioids into your food supply.
I'm not sure exactly what their main motivations are, but it would be a deterrent to people misusing poppy seeds for the purposes of obtaining those opiates. Some people add some other substances. For example, lemon juice is thought to maybe help to extract some even better. And then they make up a tea. So they might have, for example, 500 grams or 1 kilo or 2.2 pounds per kilo, or 2.2 pounds of poppy seeds, which they would add to a litre of water. I'm sorry, I can't translate that.
That's okay. I will be the first to tell you the U.S. system of measures are all wrong, and everyone knows that. So it's right.
So maybe 1 to 2 pounds worth or 1 kilo of poppy seeds are put into water, maybe with some lemon juice, and then they're left to sit there for a little bit. Then the poppy seeds are strained off and then the liquid is consumed. And within that is the opioids.
And this is legal in Australia. There's no restrictions around purchasing.
Correct. All of the poppy seeds that were encountered as part of this cluster were purchased from your local supermarket.
And people would generally be using this. You said you ran into this in the addiction medicine world. This is something people use to prevent opioid withdrawal or to treat substance use disorder by themselves. Is that kind of correct?
Correct. It could be used to treat their own substance use disorders. It could be used to treat various sorts of physical or mental health conditions. There's a whole range of different reasons why someone may seek to use a poppy seed tea.
The same range of conditions why someone might use opioids in the first place, because they have a pharmacologic effect that gives them a response. Okay, so
Correct.
This is something that people are doing. It's in that sphere of homemade medicines, maybe traditional medicines. And it sounds like it might be country specific, whether you're going to run into these unwashed poppy seeds. But in Australia, you certainly have them. So
correct.
You hear about this first patient, Kath, and they go up to the ICU. It sounds like you were initially concerned about stimulant, but then there must have been some additional work that helped you identify maybe more patients and reconsider the poppy seeds.
Yeah, like any good story, we were all drinking at one of our friends' houses on a Sunday afternoon. And the person who'd done the tox ward round that day mentioned, oh, look, there were 2 more patients who's had poppy seed tea. You know, it's not quite right. There was this old bloke who had muscle cramps who'd been using it for ages and that had never happened before. And there was a young guy who'd had some muscle cramps and also had a seizure. And so we've had 2 more cases. And we were all sitting around and we were like, how bizarre. It must be the poppy seed tea. And I think it was a Sunday afternoon and Amanda was our fellow and we were like, oh, you're on tomorrow, Amanda. You should give them all a call and see if we can get a link, and I'll have a chat to my friend in public health and we'll see if we can't start looking at this, and perhaps we should ask the other states as to whether or not they're seeing anything similar. Because I think by this stage, we'd actually heard one of the brands, Hoyts, had been involved in at least 2 of the cases, which is an Australian brand for herbs and spices, and that's sold all across the country. And so I ended up putting a post on our Teams page, which is how the different poison centres across the country communicate with each other, just be like, has anyone else seen this? We've had some odd cases with poppy seed tea. And within an hour or 2, I had a response from New South Wales and Victoria, both saying that they'd had a case as well, which just solidified that this was something that obviously we needed to investigate a bit more.
That is really fascinating. So let's transition here. What were we seeing? How long were we seeing problems and how severe? I know there was 2 cardiac arrests. So can you talk a little bit about just the clinical experience of managing these patients? What was normal? What was extreme?
We seem to have mild toxicity and extreme toxicity in Queensland. So there was 2 cases who presented in cardiac arrest. The first case that I mentioned, which was the first one that we realised of the cluster. But then not long after we issued the warning, and in New South Wales, our warning went out to ambulance service and as well as the emergency departments. And it was in fact one of the ambulance officers who rang, knowing our unit, rang us directly to say, we're on the way to hospital. This has happened. This guy's had poppy seed tea. He's in arrest. And we rang through ahead of time to the receiving hospital to give them the heads up. And he presented it very similarly to the first patient. He had seizures. His pH was in the mid-6s. That certainly they weren't responding and they were intubated very early on in their illness. Tragically, this man was older. He was in his 60s and he developed life-threatening organ failure and didn't survive. And so he passed away, which was really tragic, despite attempts at best efforts. And the other chap, the first chap who'd been just as sick, coming in with a pH of 6.5, actually survived with minimal complications in the long run, went home after a brief stint at rehab to fully recover, which was really lucky. But the other patients we had, they might have had some spasms, some increased rigidity. One had a seizure, but were actually not particularly unwell. I know Darren had some interesting cases that were a little bit different presenting.
Yes, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so we did see some differences in some of our patients. For example, of 3 patients that we reported on, only one of those required intubation. That was due to recurrent seizures. But those seizures were sufficiently severe that they had fractures and dislocations. One of our patients had a very typical features that's often described with strychnine. He'd actually made up his own tea. He'd never used it before because someone said, we'll help you with stress while you do an assignment or something or other. And so he'd been sipping that while working on his paper. And he presented to hospital because of myoclonus and rigidity, with these episodes of tonic-clonic activity lasting for 15 to 30 seconds, even though he was still awake. And he had some vomiting and nausea and tachycardia. But he also spoke about how this involuntary activity was precipitated by slight noises. For example, a bird outside would be tweeting and it would cause his muscles to go off. It's just a bit jumpy, particularly when the bird's tweeting. And it's probably because of his anxiety about his project. But no, he was poisoned. But otherwise, the other cases were fairly similar. And these are patients who weren't particularly unwell.
Probably a little bit of an interesting signal You all found out your incidence of poppy seed tea users within each region relatively quickly, as this impacted a somewhat small population of substance users. And I'm glad to hear that many of them got really excellent care. Okay, so we have all these patients all reporting the same substance and all reporting a similar toxidrome of neuroexcitation, convulsions, or spasticity. It's hard to ignore that signal. So what were the next steps? You identified several patients. Now you had 3 with your own, plus several poison centers, and a product that's sold across the entire country. All right, if you want more, check out the supporting feed where you can not only help support the show, but get much more in-depth discussion from each of these outbreaks. Thanks for listening. See you at the next episode of A Morel Dilemma.